She stepped off that stage with bruises on her face, and he said, "You're safe now." If you're watching this from somewhere in this wide-eyed world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Clara and Caleb's story travels. Hit that like button, settle in, and stay with me. Because what happens next will remind you that some people come into your life not by accident, but by grace. The night Caleb Reston made the decision that would change everything, he was standing outside in the cold, with no particular reason to be there. It was habit mostly. 5 years of solitude had given him habits that made no sense to anyone but himself, walking the perimeter of his property, at odd hours checking fences that didn't need checking, studying skies that told him nothing he didn't already know. The ranch hands he'd hired for spring roundup had long since bedded down in the bunkhouse. The cattle were settled. The horses were still. There was nothing out here that required his attention, and yet here he stood, boot heels sinking into the frost-stiffened mud of the yard brims, rising in pale clouds against the black Montana sky. The letter from Howard Finch's matrimonial agency sat on his kitchen table. He'd left it there 3 days ago after reading it 4 times. He hadn't touched it since, but he hadn't been able to stop thinking about it either. Your prospective match, Miss Clara Whitmore of Boston, has confirmed her acceptance of your proposal and will arrive by stage on Friday the 14th. She is a woman of good character, considerable, practical intelligence, and genuine desire for honest partnership on the frontier. We are confident this arrangement will prove mutually beneficial. Mutually beneficial. The words had a businesslike quality that should have reassured him. This was a practical matter, a transaction between two consenting adults who needed something the other could provide. He needed help running this place, someone to keep the domestic side of things functioning while he worked the land. She needed a home, a husband, a future in a country where women without either had precious few options. Practical. Sensible. Nothing romantic about it. He'd been telling himself that for 6 weeks. Caleb tilted his head back and looked at the stars. They were extraordinary out here in a way they'd never been in the towns he'd passed through, so many of them so dense and bright, they gave the darkness a texture. Sarah used to say the sky was the one thing nobody could fence off or buy up. She'd said that standing in a yard, not unlike this one, 5 years, and 300 miles south, her hand in his, her face turned upward with an expression that made his chest hurt even now in memory. He pushed the thought away. He'd gotten good at that. The pushing. Friday was tomorrow. He went inside, banked the fire, and tried to sleep. The stage was late. It was always late out of Helena. The road through the valley did terrible things to axles and schedules alike, but today the delay felt personal. Caleb stood outside the territorial office in Benson Creek and watched the eastern horizon with the particular patience of a man who had learned through considerable trial and error that the world moved at its own pace regardless of human preference. The town was small and mean in the way of frontier settlements that hadn't yet decided whether they would grow or simply endure. Main Street ran 200 yards of rutted track between false-fronted buildings that promised more than they delivered. There was Haggerty's General Store, the land office, a barber who also pulled teeth, a saloon that doubled as a hotel when the need arose, and a scattering of lesser establishments filling the gaps. The territorial office where Caleb waited was a one-room affair, with a roof that leaked in spring and walls that let the wind through in winter, presided over by a clerk named Morris, who had been in Benson Creek so long, he'd started to resemble the furniture. People were watching him. He was aware of it the way you become aware of a splinter, not immediately but building. Caleb Reston, the recluse of the northern range, standing in the middle of town in a clean shirt on a Friday morning. The fact of it was too interesting to ignore. Let them look. He'd had a bath yesterday, visited the barber for the first time since November. His hat was newer than anything else he owned, bought for the occasion, without quite admitting to himself why the occasion warranted it. He held it now in both hands and resisted the urge to turn it around. Stage is coming. Young Timothy Brooks, who spent his days perched on the water trough, watching the roads, shouted it from across the street. He pointed east. Caleb looked. Dust rising against the pale sky, a column of it catching the morning light. The stage rounded the bend 4 minutes later, wheels throwing up pale dirt, the driver's calls to his team, carrying sharp and clear across the still air. Caleb moved to the edge of the street, aware of his own heartbeat in a way that irritated him. This was practical. This was a transaction. There was no reason for his hands to be doing what they were doing. The coach rocked to a stop. The driver, a weathered man called Sykes, who'd been running this route since before Montana had been a territory, climbed down with the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many hours on a hard seat. He caught Caleb's eye across the street, and something moved through his expression, a quick flicker that Caleb couldn't read. "Walker," Sykes said, then corrected himself. "Reston, got a passenger for you." Before Caleb could respond, the coach door opened. A hand emerged first, small, feminine, gripping the doorframe with white-knuckle precision. Then a boot feeling carefully for the step. Then the woman herself, and time did something peculiar. It slowed, stretched, opened up around a single moment that Caleb would carry with him for the rest of his life. She was smaller than he'd expected, though he realized he'd formed no concrete expectations, only a vague shape in his imagination. She wore a traveling dress of dark blue calico, road dusty, and a bonnet with a veil that obscured her face. She stepped into the street and turned toward him, and as she moved, the veil shifted. The damage was visible even from where he stood. Purple bruising covered the left side of her face, spreading up from her jaw toward her eye, which was swollen nearly shut. Her lip was split healing, but recent. She held herself with a careful rigidity that spoke of pain managed through sheer force of will, shoulders back, chin up, every line of her posture, a declaration that she would not be reduced to the sum of her injuries. Their eyes met. Hers were green. He noticed a dark, complicated green like deep water over mossy stone. And they were full of something that hit him square in the chest, a hope so fragile and so fiercely contained that it nearly broke his composure entirely. "Mr. Reston." Her voice was soft, educated, with the particular flatness of a Boston accent smoothed by years of careful self-presentation. It was the voice of someone who had been trained to take up the least possible amount of the space. "Miss Whitmore." He removed his hat. Around them, he was acutely aware of the town's attention, a dozen pairs of eyes taking in every detail, constructing a story that would be told and retold for weeks. He pushed the awareness aside. "Are you hurt anywhere else, beyond what I can see?" She blinked. Whatever she'd been braced for, it hadn't been that. "I'm managing," she said carefully. "It looks worse than it is." That was almost certainly a lie, and they both knew it. Sykes approached, carrying her trunk with an ease that suggested it held very little. He gave Caleb a look that communicated something the man wasn't willing to say aloud, then jerked his chin toward the wagon Caleb had left hitched at the rail. Caleb nodded. "Miss Whitmore," he said, keeping his voice low and even, "there's a bench outside the general store. If you'll wait there, I'll see to your things." She studied him for a moment, assessing he realized the way someone does when they've learned that apparent kindness often conceals its opposite. Whatever she concluded, she nodded and moved toward the bench with careful, measured steps. Caleb and Sykes loaded the trunk in silence. As they finished, the driver pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. "This came with her, Marie, Sykes said quietly, from Finch at the agency. Said it was private." Caleb took it. The seal was already broken. The driver's expression acknowledged this without apology. "Finch wanted me to know what I was carrying," Sykes said. "Whatever trouble she's in, Reston, it followed her onto that stage. I figured you had a right to know before she stepped off it." He paused. "You can put her back on tomorrow if you want. No harm, no judgment." Caleb looked at the envelope, then at the woman on the bench. A child was asking its mother something in a carrying whisper. "Why does that lady's face look like that?" And Clara Whitmore was sitting with perfect stillness, her hands folded in her lap, her chin lifted by a fraction of an inch against the weight of being looked at. The movement was small and defiant and entirely unconscious. "I'm sure," Caleb said. Sykes shrugged. "Your funeral." He broke the seal on the envelope and read, "Mr. Reston, by the time you read this, you will have met Miss Clara Whitmore and observed her condition. I will be direct as the situation demands. Miss Whitmore came to this agency 4 weeks ago seeking immediate placement. She bore the injuries you now see, carried only what would fit in a single trunk, and arrived with the particular composure of someone who has learned to perform wellness under difficult circumstances. When questioned, she revealed that she was fleeing her uncle, Mr. Edmund Whitmore of Boston, who has served as her legal guardian since her parents' deaths when she was 12. The injuries you see are recent. Our physician found evidence of injuries sustained over a period of years. She is not, I must be honest with you, in any condition to fulfill the typical duties of a wife. She requires sanctuary more than ceremony. There is, however, a further matter you should be aware of. Edmund Whitmore is not simply a man who exceeded the bounds of guardianship. Our inquiries, made carefully through trusted channels, suggest that he has been systematically concealing the true extent of Miss Whitmore's inheritance from her parents. Her father, a shipping merchant, left a substantial estate. The amount Miss Whitmore believes she inherited and the amount she should have inherited are not the same figure. Edmund Whitmore has had access to those funds for 10 years. A woman who might expose this is a woman he cannot afford to lose. I do not tell you this to alarm you, but to ensure you understand the nature of the man who may come looking for her. He is not merely a wrong guardian seeking his ward's return. He is a man with considerable financial motivation to maintain control over her. You are under no obligation to proceed. If you choose to send her back, I will attempt to find alternative placement, though I confess our options are limited and time is not on her side. If you choose to offer her refuge, I believe you to be a man of sufficient character to make this choice go in with both eyes open. Respectfully, Howard Finch, Finch Matrimonial Agency, Helena. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he folded it, tucked it into his jacket, and walked back to where Clara Whitmore sat. She watched him come. He could see her bracing the small, almost invisible preparation of someone accustomed to receiving bad news. He stopped in front of her, held her gaze. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "I read the letter from the agency. I know you're running from something. I know you're hurt worse than you're letting on, and I know this situation isn't what either of us bargained for." He paused. "Here's what I want you to understand. My ranch is a day's ride north. It's remote, and it's rough, and it's nothing to look at. But it's mine, and on my land you'll be safe. No one will hurt you. No one will touch you. No one will demand anything you're not willing to give." She went very still. Her hands tightened around the handle of her carpet bag. "I know about the money," he added, "about what your uncle may have taken from you. That doesn't change what I'm offering. You need time to heal and time to think. You'll have both." A single tear moved down her bruised cheek. She wiped it away quickly as though ashamed of it. "Why?" The word was barely audible. Caleb thought about Sarah, about a yard not unlike this one, and a choice he hadn't made, and the weight of that unchosen moment he'd carried every day since. "Because it's right," he said, "and because I've had enough practice doing the wrong thing to know the difference." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood, picked up her carpet bag, and said, "I can work, Mr. Reston. I'm not asking for charity. I can cook and clean and tend a garden. I'm not useless." "Didn't figure you were." "Then let's go," she said, "before you change your mind." The ghost of something, not quite a smile, but the place where one might grow, crossed his face. "Wagons this way." The ride north took them through country that grew wilder by the mile. The road, such as it was, wound through grasslands scattered with sage and the first brave wildflowers of spring, purple and yellow, low to the ground, clinging to soil that was only beginning to soften. Mountains rose to the west, their peaks still white, their lower slopes the deep green-black of pine forest. The sky was enormous, the pale blue of new denim, washed 100 times streaked with high, thin clouds that moved slowly toward the east. Clara sat beside him on the wagon seat and said nothing for the first hour. Caleb drove and respected it. He'd learned in 5 years of solitude that silence was not the same as absence. It had texture and quality and meaning. The silence beside him now was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone learning how to breathe. "There's a canteen under the seat," he said eventually. "Water's fresh." She retrieved it, drank carefully, replaced it. "Thank you." But they said nothing else for another 20 minutes. When they stopped at a creek crossing to let the horses drink, Clara climbed down before he could help her, moving with the deliberate care of someone rationing pain, and walked to the water's edge. She stood there for a while, looking at her reflection in the current. Then she knelt, cupped water in her hands, and washed her face with movements that seemed less about cleaning and more about something private. When she stood and turned, her expression had changed. Something had been said. "Mr. Reston," she said, "I need you to understand something." He leaned against the wagon wheel and gave her his attention. "I came to the agency knowing exactly what a mail order arrangement entails, a practical arrangement between two adults. I expected to earn my place through labor and to fulfill the duties of a wife in exchange for security." She met his eyes steadily. I can't do that right now. The agency letter will have told you why. It did. I intend to honor our agreement once I've healed. I'm not seeking pity. What if, Caleb said slowly, I told you I'm not interested in an arrangement where you're paying a debt. Wariness moved across her face. Then I'd want to know what arrangement you are interested in. You come to the ranch. You heal. You help however you're able and only as much as you're able. When we talk again about what comes next. Maybe that's the arrangement you're describing. Maybe it's something else. Maybe I help you get established somewhere on your own. We figure it out. He pushed off from the wagon. You don't owe me anything, Miss Whitmore. Not yet, and maybe not ever. She was quiet for a moment. You do that, she said. Just give me time with no guarantee of anything in return. I've been alone 5 years. A few more months won't kill me. He moved to check the horse's feet. And truthfully, I could use the company, even if all you do is point out what needs doing while I do it. Something moved in her eyes, surprise, and beneath it the careful beginning of something she wasn't ready to name. I'm not only going to point, she said. Didn't figure that either. They remounted and continued north. The homestead came into view in the late afternoon, settled in a shallow valley that seemed designed by the land itself to offer shelter. Cottonwoods stood on the south side, their new leaves catching the light like small flames. The cabin was log construction, solid and ornate, the work of someone who had prioritized function and had the skill to achieve it. A covered porch ran along the front. A barn stood nearby, weathered but sound. Beyond it, cattle moved slowly across the grazing land, and smoke was rising from the chimney because Caleb had banked a fire that morning without quite being able to explain why. He pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. Clara climbed down before he could help her again. She turned slowly, taking in the homestead and the valley of the mountains that closed the western horizon. She stood for a long moment in the late afternoon light, and her face did something complicated that he didn't try to interpret. It's beautiful, she said. Caleb had been preparing a list of practical disclaimers. The roof was sound, but the kitchen window didn't close flush. The well was actually a spring 50 yards uphill. The nearest neighbor was Maggie Holt, 12 miles south, and they'd never properly met, and the observation caught him entirely off guard. You think so? I think, she said carefully, that it's the first place I've been in a very long time where no one is watching. Where there are no eyes measuring me against a standard I didn't set. She paused. Yes, I think it's beautiful. He showed her inside. The cabin was 2 rooms, a main space with a stone fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, and a kitchen area along one wall, and a smaller bedroom with a simple bed, a dresser, and a window that faced east. He'd made the bed that morning with clean linens, a fact he was now fiercely committed to not mentioning. Bedroom's yours, he said, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed. I'll take the loft. It's where I usually sleep warmer in winter, and there's a good cross breeze in summer. I can't take your room. You can, and you will. He kept his voice even. You need privacy and a door that closes. The loft suits me fine. She looked like she wanted to argue. The argument died somewhere in her throat. Thank you, she said quietly. There's a washstand there. Pitcher's full, water's cold but clean. I'll bring more after I tend the horses. He stopped at the doorway. You're safe here, Miss Whitmore. I meant what I said in town. She was still for a moment, her back to him, one hand resting on the dresser. Clara, she said, if we're to share a roof, you should call me Clara. Caleb, then. He went out to tend the horses. The routine of caring for animals unhitching, brushing down, settling them in their stalls with fresh water and hay, gave his hands something to do while his mind worked through what had just happened. He'd upended his life, invited trouble to his doorstep for a woman he'd known less than 8 hours. He'd read a letter describing her as a liability and decided to bring her home anyway. He should feel reckless. He felt instead like he'd finally done something worth doing. When he came back in from the barn, he found Clara standing at the kitchen area studying the contents of his shelves with the focused expression of someone taking inventory. She changed into a plainer dress, dove gray cotton, worn soft, and her hair was down from its pins and braided loosely over one shoulder. Without the traveling dress and the bonnet without the road dust, she looked younger, more real. You have more here than you probably know, she said without turning around. Someone put thyme and dried rosemary at the back of this shelf. There's good flour cornmeal, salt pork, and unless I'm wrong, at least 2 jars of last summer's preserves behind the vinegar. The rosemary might have been there when I bought the place. He moved to the fireplace, checked the fire, added a log. I don't cook much beyond what's necessary. That much I can tell. She said it without judgment, simply as observation. Would you mind if I made supper? I'd like to do something useful. I'll help. You don't have to. I know. He pulled out a chair from the table and sat where he could keep watch without being obvious about it. I'll tell you where things are and stay out of your way. She gave him a look that suggested she saw through this strategy immediately, but she didn't protest. They worked together in the small space, him supplying information and occasionally reaching past her for the heavier items, her moving carefully around her own injuries, with practiced efficiency that spoke of long experience managing pain while functioning. He watched the way she held her left arm close to her side. Cracked ribs, he thought. Maybe broken. She'd need time before those healed properly. The meal she produced from his sparse stores was simple, a stew from preserved venison, and the vegetables he hadn't known he had thick bread, toasted over the fire, but it was better than anything he'd eaten in months. She sat across from him at the table and ate slowly, carefully, in the manner of someone not entirely sure when the next meal might come. How long have you been here? She asked after a silence that had been comfortable rather than awkward. On this ranch. 5 years. Built the cabin myself. Started the herd with money I saved cowboying down in Wyoming. She looked up at the mention of Wyoming but didn't ask. You like it, the isolation. I got used to it. That's not the same thing. He considered her. She was watching him with the particular attention of someone who had learned to read people carefully because her safety depended on it. No, he agreed. It's not. What made you answer the agency advertisement? The honest answer was complicated. He'd written the letter in January, in the worst part of winter, when 3 weeks of snow had kept him confined to the cabin, and the silence had taken on a quality he couldn't name, not peaceful, not merely quiet, but something heavier. Empty, maybe. A silence shaped like something that wasn't there. Practical reasons, he said, which was part of the truth. She nodded as though she'd expected that answer and wasn't sure she believed it. My reasons were practical too, she said. The inheritance from my parents became legally mine on my 22nd birthday. Not much. My uncle had managed it for 10 years, which should tell you something about its current state, but enough to pay the agency fee and buy passage west. My uncle didn't want me to leave. She set down her fork. We disagreed, violently. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd do all of that himself. He's a thorough man. Is there anyone in Boston who knows where you are? The agency, and one friend, a woman who helped me get to the station. She knows enough to say nothing. Clara picked up her fork again, then set it down. The letter from Mr. Finch said my uncle has resources, connections, that he'd make inquiries. He will. Yes. She met his eyes. I'm sorry, I know that makes me a complication. Trouble comes whether you invite it or not, Caleb said. I'd rather face it having done the right thing. She was quiet for a long moment. My uncle believes he has a legal claim to me, she said finally. Guardian rights until I turn 25 or marry. He'll use them if he can. We'll deal with that when it comes, and you say that very calmly for a man who didn't know me this morning. I'm calmer than I look. He stood, began clearing the dishes. Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch, but you sleep until you're ready. That's the only rule that matters right now. She rose from the table, moving toward the bedroom door. At the threshold, she stopped. Caleb. Yeah. Thank you for not being sensible. He almost smiled. Don't thank me yet. Ask me again in a month. She went in. He heard the door close, and then after a moment, the soft sound of a latch being turned. Not to keep him out, he thought, just because she could. He stood in the silent cabin, listening to the fire settle and the wind work its way through the cottonwoods, and thought that the silence had a different quality tonight than it had last night. It was still quiet, it was not empty. He banked the fire and climbed to the loft and lay looking at the underside of the roof for a long time before sleep came. The first week established a rhythm that was less like routine and more like negotiation. Clara pushed to do more than she should. Caleb pushed back. They met somewhere in the middle, finding the edges of what her body would allow before protest became injury. She took over the cooking immediately and without discussion moving through his kitchen with increasing confidence as she learned where things were and what he had. Her meals transformed his existence more than he would have predicted, not because they were elaborate, which they weren't, but because for the first time in years, someone was cooking for him as well as themselves. There was a difference. It showed up in small ways. An extra measure of spice. The bread cut thick rather than thin. She mended his shirts, of which there were several in states of advanced disrepair that he'd been meaning to address for 2 winters. She organized the cabin's single main room with a quiet efficiency that somehow made the space feel larger, moving nothing dramatically but positioning everything better. She found the rosemary on the back shelf and used it, and the stew that night tasted different than any stew he had made in 5 years. In return, he showed her the ranch. He taught her how to read the weather in the color of the western sky at sundown. Red fire meant wind, orange spread wide meant clear, purple-gray along the mountain line meant storm before morning. He showed her which cattle were likely to wander, which fence posts were starting to lean, where the spring ran strongest, and where it slowed in late summer. She absorbed it all with the focused attention of someone building something, not just learning. On the 4th morning, she got up before him. He descended the loft ladder to find her at the stove stirring something that smelled of cinnamon and toasted grain, her hair still in its night braid, the gray light of pre-dawn coming through the east window. He stopped on the bottom rung and watched for a moment before she heard him. "My mother used to make this," she said without turning. "Oats with sugar and dried apple when she could get it. I found oats in your stores. Help yourself. I always ask first." A pause. "Or I do now." He understood what she meant. He didn't comment on it. He poured coffee and sat, and they ate the warm, sweet porridge in the dim morning, while dawn came up over the eastern rim of the valley in long bars of pale gold. "The swelling is less," he said after a while. She touched her face experimentally. The worst of the discoloration had faded from purple to the sickly yellow-green of healing. The eye was mostly open now. "The ribs still hurt," she said, "but less when I breathe. That's improvement. Give them another 2 weeks. I was thinking I might try the garden today, the patch behind the cabin." He'd planted the same kitchen garden every spring, out of habit, then let roughly half of it go to seed while he ate the same monotonous meals week after week. The beds were visible from the kitchen window, winter weedy and neglected. "It needs work," he said. "I know, I can see that from here. You stop the minute anything hurts." She gave him a look that had stopped being wounded and started being amused somewhere in the previous 3 days. "I'll stop when it hurts enough to matter. That's not... I know what's not sensible, Caleb. I also know what I can and can't do." She gathered the bowls and moved to the wash basin. "I'll stop before I damage anything. I promise." He let her have the argument because she was right, and because the particular quality of her voice when she drew her own boundaries, careful, firm, surprised at itself, was something he didn't want to flatten. She was out behind the cabin by mid-morning. He rode out to check the cattle in the far pasture and didn't let himself circle back more than twice. When he returned in early afternoon, the garden had been transformed. The weeds were gone. The beds were neatly delineated, the soil turned and aerated. She'd staked the tomato starts he'd put in and forgotten about and tied off the bean vines that had been sprawling. The whole plot looked, as she'd predicted, considerably more hopeful than it had any right to. Clara sat on the porch steps with dirt under her fingernails and her hair escaping its braid and her face flushed with exertion. She looked satisfied in a way he hadn't seen from her before, a satisfaction that came from the inside out, from the body's particular knowledge of useful labor. "You've been busy," he said. "It's a good garden." She looked up at him. "Or it will be, come harvest." The words sat between them, a casual future tense, an assumption of continued presence. Neither of them remarked on it. "Come harvest," Caleb agreed. The evening she unpacked her trunk felt like a turning point, though he couldn't have said exactly why. She'd been living out of it since her arrival, as though keeping her things packed maintained some option to leave. Now she brought it into the main room and began taking things out, folding clothes onto the pegs along the bedroom wall, arranging a small hairbrush and mirror on the dresser, setting 3 books on the shelf above the fireplace. I brought these, she said, handing him the books as though presenting credentials. I could only carry what fit, but I thought you might there was room. I hope you don't mind. He took them with more care than the gesture probably warranted. Shakespeare, a dog-eared copy of Jane Eyre, a slim volume of poetry by someone he didn't recognize. I haven't had anything new to read in a while, he said. They're not new. She watched him turn the Shakespeare over in his hands. Though I'm not sure how useful the sonnets will be out here. Never know. Might come in handy if the cattle start demanding verse. She laughed. It was unexpected, a real laugh surprised out of her, short and bright. It transformed her face in a way that caught him unprepared. Without the bruising, without the careful management she was, he looked away back at the books. Thank you, he said, for the books. Thank you for the shelf to put them on. That night, after she'd gone to bed, he sat at the table with the Shakespeare open to nothing in particular and thought about what it meant that she was settling in, putting down roots in the small space he'd offered, choosing day by day to be here. It was a dangerous kind of thinking. He closed the book and went to sleep. 10 days after her arrival, Caleb suggested a ride to the northern boundary of the property where a creek ran through a stand of aspens that were just beginning to leaf out. There's something I want to show you, he said at breakfast, if you're up for it. She'd been gaining strength steadily, the ribs troubling her less, her movements losing their careful rationing. She was riding capable, he judged carefully at a walk, nothing too rough. I haven't ridden in years, she said. But yes. He saddled both horses, chose the gentler of the two for her, showed her the adjustments to make. She mounted with the remembered confidence of someone who'd ridden as a child and was retrieving an old skill. Her posture was correct, her hands light on the reins. He didn't need to tell her anything. They rode north across the property in the warm morning. The grass was fully green now, the wildflowers coming in properly, whole stretches of purple and yellow extending toward the foothills. Hawks circled overhead in their patient spirals. The mountains to the west were losing their snowcap in thin bands, dark rock appearing beneath the white. The creek, when they reached it, was running clear and cold over smooth stones. The aspens stood in a loose cluster above the bank, their leaves catching the light and turning it into something like motion, a perpetual shimmer, not quite wind, not quite water, something between. Caleb dismounted and helped Clara down and led her to a flat rock near the water's edge. This is my favorite place on the property, he said. I come here when I need to think. She looked around at it for a long time. Then she knelt and trailed her fingers through the current and watched the water move around them. Why did you want to show me? I wanted you to know it exists. Oh, he sat on the rock beside her, in case you ever need somewhere to go, inside the refuge. She looked at him. Understanding moved across her face, and with it something softer, a gratitude that wasn't about the place but about the understanding behind it. They sat together on the bank, and neither of them spoke for a while. The creek ran between them, and the silence was alive with it, the particular quality of quiet that exists between two people who have stopped performing for each other. Caleb hadn't been in a quiet like that in 5 years. He'd forgotten it was possible. Can I ask you something? Clara said at last. Sure. In Wyoming. She kept her eyes on the water. The woman you mentioned, Sarah. He went still. You said it was why you helped me, she said carefully, but you didn't finish the story. What happened after you left? Caleb picked up a flat stone, turned it over. I rode north, he said. Figured she was better off without me in the picture, that I'd done enough damage by being there, gotten her beaten, nearly gotten her worse. Told myself leaving was the merciful thing. He paused. 6 months later, I heard through a cowboy working the eastern range that she'd married a banker from Cheyenne. Her father's arrangement. Supposed to be a good match by her father's accounting. And by hers, I don't know. It was an honest answer. I never wrote to find out. That's one of the things I live with. Clara was quiet for a moment. You don't know if she's all right. No. Have you thought about finding out? The question landed with more weight than she probably intended. He'd thought about it, of course he had, in the worst of the long Montana winters when there was nothing to do but think. He'd composed letters in his head and never written them. He'd told himself it would make things worse, not better for her to hear from him. He'd told himself he had no right to reopen a wound for the sake of his own conscience. He'd told himself a lot of things. Some things are better left to settle, he said. Clara looked at him, then a steady assessing look that reminded him she was considerably more perceptive than her quiet manner suggested. Or left to fester, she said, depending on the thing. He didn't have an answer for that. They rode back in the late morning, and the silence between them had shifted again, richer, somehow textured, with the shared weight of things that hadn't been said, but had been acknowledged. He found himself looking at the back of her head as she rode ahead of him on the easier ground, the dark braid moving against her gray dress, and thinking that she was the first person in 5 years who had made him want to say more rather than less. It was a dangerous kind of thinking. He'd already decided that. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Maggie Holt arrived. She came on a Tuesday unannounced, materializing out of the southern hills on a sturdy quarter horse, with a pair of saddlebags that clinked with the particular sound of glass jars. Caleb was working in the corral when he spotted her coming and stood with one hand on the fence rail, watching her approach with the neutral alertness of a man who had learned that unexpected visitors were often complicated. She was a tall woman, 60 or thereabouts, with white hair pulled back severely, and a face that had been handsome once, and was now something better weathered into character lined with expressions that had earned themselves. She sat a horse with the ease of someone who'd been doing it since before Caleb was born. "Caleb Reston," she said, drawing up at the corral gate. Not a question. "Mrs. Holt." She looked at him for a moment with sharp brown eyes that reminded him of hawks, not predatory exactly, but missing nothing. "Margaret Holt, 12 miles south. I heard you had company. News travels. It's a quiet county. News is what we have." She dismounted with more agility than her years suggested. "I brought preserves, rhubarb and early strawberry. Figured your new guest might appreciate something sweet." The pause before guest was deliberate and without judgment, an acknowledgement of ambiguity. "She's inside," Caleb said. "Come in." He'd anticipated awkwardness, Clara's wariness of strangers, Maggie's unknown quantities, the particular tension of an established solitude accepting another intrusion. What he hadn't anticipated was the thing that happened instead. Clara came out to the porch at the sound of horses, and she and Maggie looked at each other for a moment across the yard. Then Maggie said, "You're the one from Boston." And Clara said, "You're the one who helped Ethan Hollis through that fever 2 winters ago." And they moved toward each other like two people who had already decided to be friends before they'd met. "Who told you about Hollis?" Caleb asked. "Timothy at the store before I left town," Clara said. "He said the woman 12 miles south had kept Hollis alive with nothing but yarrow tea and pig-headedness. I thought that sounded worth knowing." She was already holding open the door for Maggie. "Come in. I made coffee this morning and it's still warm." Caleb stood in the yard for a moment, listening to the sound of two women talking inside his cabin, then led Maggie's horse to the water trough and thought that his life had become considerably stranger than he'd planned. Inside, he found them at the table with the coffee and the rhubarb preserves already open, talking about herbs. "Yarrow for fever. Yes, but the real thing is keeping them hydrated when they can't keep anything down," Maggie was saying. She had her hands wrapped around her mug with the comfort of someone who spent a great deal of time outdoors. "Hollis kept trying to sit up, and I kept telling him a dead man is less useful than a live one, so he'd better decide which he wanted to be." Clara was smiling properly fully, the smile that showed the laugh behind it. "And he believed you. He believed the look on my face, which was entirely sincere." Maggie glanced at the bruising, now fading but still visible. "You're healing well," she said without making it a subject. "Are the ribs still tight?" "Less than a week ago. I'll leave you some comfrey salve. It won't speed the bone, but it helps with the muscle pain around the site." Maggie said it with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had been the only medical resource for 50 square miles for 20 years and had long since stopped treating bodies as delicate subjects. Caleb sat at the table's end and drank his coffee and found himself doing something he hadn't done since his early 20s, watching the room with something like contentment. Maggie stayed through the afternoon. She had opinions about the garden, which she shared freely and which Clara received with genuine interest rather than deference. She had stories about the county, not gossip exactly, but the accumulated history of a long-established woman who had been present for most of what had happened within 30 miles and remembered it clearly. She was, Caleb thought, exactly the kind of person Clara needed, someone competent and certain who treated capability as unremarkable and fragility as something to be addressed practically rather than sentimentalized. Before she left, Maggie took Caleb aside by the barn. "That's a woman worth helping," she said, which was high praise from a woman who chose her words carefully. "She's steadier than she looks, the kind that gets steadier under pressure rather than less." "I know." Maggie looked at him with those hawk eyes. "You planning to do right by her?" "I'm planning to let her decide what right looks like." The old woman considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Better answer than most men would give." She mounted her horse. "You have trouble out here, you send someone to me first. Before the sheriff, before the agency, before anyone else. I know this county, and I know the people in it, and I know things about both that would surprise you." She gathered her reins. "That goes especially if the trouble comes from Boston." Caleb looked at her sharply. "What do you know about Boston?" "Only that trouble which starts there doesn't stay there." Maggie touched her hat brim. "Good evening, Reston. Tell your the same deliberate pause guest that I'll be back Thursday with that salve." She rode south and disappeared into the hills, and Caleb stood watching the place where she'd been and trying to figure out exactly how much she knew and how she knew it. The letter came 4 weeks to the day after Clara's arrival, delivered by a passing rider who said it had been sitting at the general store in town since Thursday. It was addressed to Clara Whitmore at a care-of address for the agency forwarded through Finch. She took it from Caleb with careful hands and carried it to the porch, and he went inside and gave her the privacy to read it. She came back in 20 minutes later with the letter folded in her hands and her face entirely composed in the way that he'd learned meant she was managing something difficult. "From Mr. Finch," she said, "and he wanted to warn me. My uncle has made inquiries at the agency about my location. Finch refused to say anything, but he's—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He says a man like my uncle doesn't take that as a final answer." "No." Caleb set down the harness he'd been mending. "He wouldn't." Clara sat down in the chair by the fireplace, the one she'd started to think of as hers, though neither of them had said so. "He'll send someone, or come himself." She looked at the letter, then at Caleb. "I brought this to your door." "You brought yourself to my door. The trouble's his." "That's a kind way of seeing it." "It's the accurate way." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "When they come, whoever he sends, what are the legal grounds? You mentioned guardian rights." "Until I turn 25 or marry." She said it steadily, watching him. "He has a court-sanctioned claim to my return as an unmarried woman of 22. He'll use it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "There's an obvious solution," he said finally. She looked at him. "I know. I'm not suggesting it right now. I'm noting that it exists." He met her eyes. "When you're ready to think about it, if you ever are, it's there. But not because he's coming. That's a bad reason." "What would be a good reason?" He thought about it. "Wanting to," he said simply. Clara looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she folded the letter carefully and put it in her pocket and said, "He'll probably send someone first, before he comes himself. That's how he works. He tests things before he commits to them. Sends proxies. Then we'll deal with the proxy when it arrives." "You say that like it's simple." "I say it like it's what comes next." He picked up the harness again. "The next thing is always the next thing. We deal with them in order." She watched him work for a while in silence. Outside, the evening was coming on, the light going golden amber over the valley. "Caleb." "Yeah." "When you were in Wyoming," she said it carefully, "after you left, did you ever find out if Sarah was all right? From anyone who might actually know?" He set the harness down. "No," he said. "I figured no news was probably news enough." Clara nodded slowly. Something moved across her face, a decision being made, he thought, and then set aside for later. "Probably," she said. The word had a weight to it he couldn't entirely account for. That night, after she'd gone to bed, Caleb sat on the porch in the dark and thought about Wyoming and the past and the particular stubbornness of the things you didn't finish. He thought about the letter in Clara's pocket and the uncle in Boston and the trouble that was coming, slow and certain as weather. He thought about the way she'd laughed when he'd mentioned cattle and sonnets. He went inside and didn't think about any of it any further, and did not entirely succeed. They came on a Friday morning in late May, two riders cresting the rise at a pace that announced purpose. Caleb was in the corral and had his rifle in his hand before they'd cleared the high ground, not raised but present. Clara was in the garden. He caught her eye across the yard. "Inside," he said quietly. now." She went without argument, which told him more about her state of mind than any words would have. He heard the bar drop across the door. The riders pulled up 20 yards out. The older one, iron gray hair, weathered face, the particular stillness of a professional, touched his hat brim. "Afternoon. You'd be Caleb Reston." "I would, and you'd be on my land without an invitation." "Victor Crane," the man said. "Out of Helena. This is my associate, Mr. Cole." He indicated the younger rider, mid-20s, dark eyes that moved too quickly, taking everything in. "We're looking for a young woman, Clara Whitmore. We have reason to believe she may be in this area." "And what business would you have with Miss Whitmore if she were—" "Her family is concerned for her welfare. She left Boston rather suddenly without proper arrangements." Crane's voice was professionally neutral, giving nothing, committing to nothing. "Her uncle, Mr. Edmund Whitmore, has retained us to locate her and ensure her safe return." "Safe return," Caleb repeated the phrase with deliberate flatness. "To his care, yes. She's a grown woman. She's a ward in the legal sense, sir, under the guardianship of—" The cabin door opened. Clara stepped onto the porch, and Caleb felt her presence behind him like a change in the air, a stillness that had been arrived at through effort, a composure that was chosen rather than natural. "Mr. Crane," she said, "you can stop pretending this is about my welfare." Crane's expression didn't shift. "Miss Whitmore, your uncle is very concerned." "My uncle is very motivated." She descended the porch steps slowly, deliberately, each step a decision. "There's a difference. What he's concerned about is the inheritance my father left, the one he's been mismanaging for 10 years. "I don't know anything about that, ma'am. I've been retained to bring me back, I know." She stopped beside Caleb. "I'm not going." Crane reached into his saddlebag. "I have a court order, ma'am, signed by—" "What judge?" Caleb asked. A slight pause. "Judge Harlan Mercer out of—" "Mercer," Caleb said, "who's been known to sign what he's paid to sign. Show me that document." Crane extended it. Caleb took it, scanned it. The language was legal sounding. The seal looked real. He folded it and handed it back. "That document says unmarried," he said, 3 different times, which tells me your client did his research." He raised the rifle, not quite aimed. "She stays. You go." Crane's jaw tightened. "Interfering with a legal order. File charges." Caleb's voice was very quiet. "Come back with a federal marshal and we'll discuss it. Right now, you're 2 men on my land with a questionable document, and I'm a man who's asking you politely to leave." The younger rider, Cole, hadn't spoken a word. But Caleb noticed the way he was looking at Clara, not with the assessment of a professional doing a job, but with something else. Something older. Recognition, maybe. Their eyes met Clara's and Cole's for just a fraction of a second. Then Crane was gathering his reins, his face smooth and professional, giving nothing away. "We'll be going, Mr. Reston, but this isn't finished." "It never is," Caleb agreed. They turned their horses. As they crested the rise and started south, Cole turned once, not quite looking back, but at an angle that let him see. Then they were gone, over the ridge and out of sight. Caleb lowered the rifle. Beside him, Clara let out a breath that she'd been holding so long it came out in a rush. Her hands were shaking, the fine, controlled tremor of someone whose body was responding to something the mind had overridden. "One more thing," Crane had called just before they disappeared. He turned his horse back one last time, voice carrying clearly across the still air. "That court order noted the unmarried status for a reason, Mr. Reston. Were the circumstances to change, were the lady to be legally wed, the guardianship would transfer to her husband. Just so you're aware of your options." Then the dust and the silence. "Cole," Clara said quietly, almost to herself. Caleb looked at her. The younger one, James Cole. She was still watching the place where they'd gone. "He worked for my father before my father died. He was a young clerk, maybe 17. I was 12. She turned to Caleb. "He recognized me. I could see it. Does that mean something?" She was quiet for a moment, working through it. "I don't know yet," she said. But he didn't say anything. When he could have confirmed everything Crane was saying, he didn't say a word. She looked at Caleb. "I think that might mean something." The afternoon was very still around them. The cattle grazed indifferently in the middle distance. A hawk circled above the far tree line. "Come inside," Caleb said. "Let's talk about what comes next." The night after Crane and Cole left, Caleb sat on the porch until past midnight. He didn't pace. He didn't rehearse arguments or construct strategies. He simply sat with the dark and let his mind work through what he knew, the way you work through a knotted rope patiently without forcing following each strand to its logical end. Edmund Whitmore was coming, not today, not next week, but the fact of it was as certain as the seasons. A man who'd spent 10 years building control over something didn't abandon that control because a hired agent was turned away at a ranch gate. He would try again, different approach, different pressure point, possibly different legal instrument. The court order they'd brought was real enough to cause trouble, even if its foundation was rotten. Judges could be bought. Sheriffs could be pressured. The law on the frontier was often less a system than a series of negotiations. Clara had told him earlier in the evening that she wanted to write to the agency, to Finch, to put her account of what happened in writing while it was fresh. She'd sat at his table with the lamplight falling across her bent head and written for nearly an hour, her pen moving with a steadiness that impressed him. Whatever fear she felt, she was not letting it make her smaller. She was, if anything, getting larger, more certain of her edges, more willing to inhabit her own space. He was in considerable trouble. He'd known it for a week. Known it the way you know a change in weather before it's visible, a pressure shift, something in the air. He told himself it was gratitude for her help around the place. He told himself it was the natural consequence of spending long days in the company of an intelligent woman after years of solitude. He told himself quite a lot of things, none of which were entirely untrue, and none of which were the whole story. He went inside when the moon was high and climbed to the loft and listened to the sounds of the cabin, the settling fire, the wind in the cottonwoods, the faint, regular breathing from the room below. He thought about Crane's parting words. Were the circumstances to change? He thought about Clara's voice when she'd said, "I'm not going the absolute flatness of it, the bedrock certainty. Not performance, not defiance for its own sake. Simple truth." He thought about what it would mean to offer her that protection and mean it from both directions, not just legal shield, but genuine choice. Not transaction, but intention. He fell asleep thinking about it and woke the next morning without resolution, but with a clearer sense of the shape of things. That was, he supposed, something. Clara was already at the stove. She turned when she heard him on the ladder, and her expression was the careful neutral of someone who had also been thinking through the night. "Coffee's ready, Mama," she said, "and I made a decision." He poured a cup and sat. "Tell me." "I'm writing to Maggie." She set a plate of eggs in front of him. She'd found the hens he'd been ignoring, gotten them laying reliably, and now there were eggs most mornings. She said to send word if trouble came from Boston. It came, she should know. Clara sat across from him with her own cup. "And I want to ask her about something else." "What something else?" A pause. She wrapped her hands around the mug. "Well, James Cole. If he worked for my father before my father died, and if he ended up working for my uncle, I want to know how that happened. Who made the connection? Whether it was his choice." She looked at Caleb. "Maggie said she knew things about the county that would surprise you. I think she might know more than that." Caleb studied her. "You're wondering if Cole can be turned. I'm wondering if he already has been." She met his eyes steadily. "He saw me. He knew who I was. And he said nothing to Crane. That's not nothing." It wasn't nothing. He'd been turning it over himself. "Write to Maggie," he said, "but be careful what you put in writing about Cole. If that letter went wrong." "I know how to be careful." She said it without impatience, a simple fact. "I spent 10 years being careful." He felt the weight of that 10 years of navigating a dangerous man's household, of managing information and presentation, and the exact calibration of what to reveal and conceal. She'd learned skills in that house that she shouldn't have had to learn, but she had them, and they were real, and dismissing them would be a particular kind of insult. "All right," he said, "write to Maggie." She did that morning, 2 letters, one to Finch at the agency with a full account of Crane and Cole's visit, and one to Maggie that was carefully worded and said more in what it didn't say than in what it did. She gave both to the hand who was riding into town for supplies that afternoon. Then she went back to the garden. Caleb watched her from the corral where he was working with a young horse that had been giving him trouble since spring, and thought that resilience was a strange thing. Not the absence of fear, but its active counterweight, the muscle you built by surviving what you'd been afraid of and discovering you were still standing. She was building that muscle in real time in front of him day by day. He went back to the horse and tried to pay attention to the horse. Maggie Holt came back on the Thursday she'd promised with the comfrey salve and a basket of things she'd decided they needed without being asked: dried herbs, a jar of rendered tallow for leatherwork, 2 jars of last autumn's apple butter, and a folded piece of paper that she put directly into Caleb's hand with a look that said it was for him first. He read it by the barn while Maggie went inside. It was brief. Maggie's handwriting was precise and angular, the hand of someone self-educated and proud of it. Reston James Cole came to my door 6 days ago. He didn't know I knew Clara's people. He was asking about the county, about you specifically, about whether there were other routes north if the main road was watched. I didn't answer his questions, but I watched his face while he asked them, and I'll tell you what, I saw a young man who has been told to do a thing and is not sure he should do it. That's different from a man who's decided. Come to supper Friday. Bring Clara. We have things to discuss that are easier in person. M.H. Caleb folded the letter and stood for a moment in the warm morning listening to the sound of 2 women talking inside his cabin again. Maggie's measured cadences, Clara's lighter voice, the occasional sound of a laugh that he was still not tired of hearing. Cole was already questioning his assignment. Maggie had seen it. That was information. He went inside. The 2 women were at the table with the salve open between them, Maggie demonstrating its application with the clinical directness of a field nurse, while Clara listened with the focused attention she brought to anything she decided was worth learning. They paused when he came in, and something passed between Clara and Maggie, a look that said they had been talking about him, or at least about the situation, and had reached some conclusions. Women who were sharp enough and trusted each other enough were, he thought, considerably more dangerous than any 2 men he'd ever encountered. Maggie's invited us to supper Friday, and he said, I know, Mom, Clara said. I already said yes. Maggie permitted herself a small, satisfied expression. Good. Now sit down, Reston, and let me tell you what I know about Edmund Whitmore. He sat. She explained, making discreet inquiries of her own since Clara's arrival. Maggie had lived in the county for 20 years, had come west after her husband was killed in the last months of the war, and had spent 2 decades building a network of information that she never called by that name, but which was in practical terms exactly that. She knew the circuit riders and the traveling merchants and the miners who came through seasonally. She knew who wrote letters east and who received them and what the general shape of those correspondences suggested. She knew Howard Finch had known him for 15 years, trusted him as much as she trusted anyone. What she had gathered about Edmund Whitmore was this. He was a man of Boston society with investments in shipping and real estate and a reputation for meticulous financial management. He was respected. He was also, by the account of 3 separate people who had worked for or adjacent to him, someone who regarded the people around him primarily as instruments useful when functioning correctly, to be repaired or replaced when they were not. His relationship with Clara had never been that of guardian to ward. It had been that of owner to asset. The inheritance question was more complicated than Finch's letter had suggested. Clara's father, William Whitmore, had been the successful brother, the one with the shipping business, the real estate holdings, the accumulated wealth of a man who had started with little and built considerably. Edmund was the younger brother, the one who'd made smaller choices and lived with the consequences of them, and who had been appointed guardian to William's daughter when William and his wife died of the fever in 1871. The estate and trust had been a godsend for Edmund. It had propped up businesses that were failing, covered debts that were accumulating, provided a financial cushion that appeared legitimate because it technically was. He was the legal administrator of those funds. Losing Clara, and with her his access to the remaining assets and the appearance of probity that guardianship provided, was not something Edmund Whitmore could easily absorb. He won't come himself, Maggie said. Not first. Men like him don't travel west and get their hands dirty. It's beneath them and beneath the image they're maintaining. He'll send Crane back with something more substantial, a different legal instrument, something harder to refuse. A declaration of incompetence, Clara said quietly. She'd known Caleb realize. She'd been braced for this piece of shit. He had a doctor write an affidavit. I found a draft of it in his desk when I was gathering my papers to leave. It said I was prone to hysterical episodes and false accusations and required supervision for my own protection. That's what he'll use, Maggie confirmed. It gives him a way to invalidate any agreement you sign, any statement you make, any marriage that isn't under his auspices. A woman declared mentally incompetent in a Massachusetts court can't enter into legal contracts. That would include a marriage contract. The words settled over the table like weather. Clara looked at her hands. Caleb looked at the table. Maggie looked at both of them with the patient expression of someone who had been waiting for this conversation to arrive. The obvious solution, Maggie said, with the directness of a woman who had never had much use for delicacy when clarity would serve, is to move faster than he can. A marriage performed in Montana territory under a legitimate officiant with a proper record filed would be very difficult to attack, and a married woman is not subject to guardian claims, regardless of what a Massachusetts court has decided about her mental state. The jurisdiction doesn't cross that cleanly. I know, Clara said. Another silence. Clara, Caleb said. She looked up at him. We discussed this, he said carefully. After Crane came, I said it needed to be for the right reasons. You did say that. That hasn't changed. I know. She held his gaze. I'm not saying it should. I'm saying I'm aware of the practical argument. I wanted it acknowledged. She turned back to Maggie. What I want to know is whether Cole can actually help us before we decide anything else. Maggie nodded as though this was the question she'd been waiting for. That depends on what kind of man he turned out to be. She folded her hands on the table. I knew his father. Briefly. Good man worked the Eastern Range for 6 or 7 years before he moved on. The son went east young, trying to make something of himself. Ended up clerking for William Whitmore, Clara's father, through his late teens. When William died, he was 19 and suddenly without a position. Edmund offered him continued employment. Maggie paused. That offer would have seemed like a lifeline to a young man with no family connections and limited options. He took it. Whether he understood what he was taking is the question. He's had 4 years to understand it, Clara said. Yes, and he came to my door 6 days ago and asked questions that only make sense if he's looking for a way out. Maggie looked at Clara directly. The question is whether you trust him enough to offer one. Clara was quiet for a moment. Caleb watched her work through it, the specific calculus of a woman who had learned that trust was a resource with real costs and real consequences. I don't trust him, she said at last. Not yet, but I think he might be trustworthy. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at Caleb. I'd like to find out which one is true before we need to know. And if we're wrong, Caleb asked, then we're no worse off than we are now, she said. Crane is already coming back with something worse. Cole knowing we're aware of him doesn't change that. She straightened slightly. What it might change is whether we have someone on the inside when it happens. Caleb looked at Maggie. The old woman spread her hands, a gesture that said, she's right and you know it. Send word to Cole through Maggie, Caleb said finally. Nothing specific, nothing that can be used against us, just that we're willing to talk. I'll handle it, Maggie said. I'm good at saying nothing in a way that communicates everything. This, Caleb thought, was entirely credible. June settled over the valley in long golden days that smelled of cut grass and warming earth. The cattle were doing well on the summer range. The garden was growing with the extravagant enthusiasm of good soil properly tended, and Clara moved through it in the mornings with the particular contentment of someone who had discovered that the satisfaction of growing things was genuine and not metaphorical, that watching a seed become food was for her a specific kind of proof that the world could be changed by patience and care. Caleb watched her from his various vantage points around the property and thought about things he had decided not to think about. They had over the weeks arrived at a domestic arrangement of considerable ease. She cooked, he did the washing up. She tended the garden and the chickens. He handled the heavy ranch work and the livestock. They took meals together morning and evening, and the conversation at those meals had deepened from the careful exchanges of their early days to something more natural, the kind of talk that moved between practical matters and opinions, and the small observations that accumulate between two people who are paying attention to each other. She had a particular laugh she made when something struck her as absurd rather than funny, a short, precise sound somewhere between a scoff and genuine amusement. He had started in engineering situations that might produce it without quite admitting to himself that he was doing this. She was teaching him to read the stars. Not navigation, he knew enough for practical purposes, but their stories. She'd learned the Greek myths from a book her father had given her. She explained one evening when they sat on the porch and the sky above was spectacularly clear, and she'd spent her childhood lying in the yard of their house in Philadelphia picking out constellations while her father named them. "That's Scorpius," she said, pointing south and low, "though it's hard to see fully from this latitude. And there that bright one, see it, that's Antares. It's actually a red star. You can tell in the right conditions." "I know where north is," Caleb said. "I know the Dipper and I know Polaris, and that's gotten me where I needed to go." "Practical," she said. "I'm a practical man." "You are." She was quiet for a moment. "And yet you keep a copy of Shakespeare." "It was in the house when I bought it." "You've read it, though." He hadn't admitted it. Most of it. She turned her head to look at him in the darkness. "Which part did you like best?" He thought about lying. Saying something about the histories, the battles, something suitably masculine and unsentimental. "The Tempest," he said instead. "The part where Prospero says he'll break his staff and drown his book. Give it all up." He paused. Seemed like something I understood. She was quiet for a long time. "Then you gave things up to come here." "Yes." "Do you miss them?" "Some of them." He looked at the sky. "Less than I expected to." She turned back to the stars and pointed out Hercules, which required some imagination from where they sat. He watched her profile in the starlight and thought that she was the most interesting person he had encountered in his adult life, and that this was a very inconvenient thing to have noticed. "Caleb?" "Yeah. I got a letter from Maggie today." She kept her voice even. "Cole wrote to her he wants to meet." The stars continued their patient rotation overhead. "Where?" he asked. "Maggie's place. She'd be present." He suggested 3 days from now, Thursday. "Is that what you want to do?" She considered it for a moment with the seriousness she brought to actual decisions, not performing deliberation but genuinely working through it. "Yes," she said. "I think he has something to tell us, and I think we need to hear it before my uncle's next move." "Then we go Thursday." She turned to look at him again, and something in her expression shifted, a subtle softening, a permission given for something she'd been holding at careful distance. "I keep waiting," she said quietly, "for the part where this becomes what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Another cage. Nicer, perhaps. Different lock. But the same essential structure." She looked at her hands in her lap, the terms changing the moment I was dependent enough not to argue. She looked up at it. "That's not what this is." "No," he said. "It's not." "I know." A pause. "I know that now. I wanted you to know that I know it." He held her gaze in the dark. The stars turned. Somewhere in the valley a coyote called once and fell silent. "Thank you," he said finally, "for saying so." She nodded, looked back at the sky, and pointed out Cygnus. He watched her hand move across the dark and thought about the difference between what he'd planned and what had happened, and found that he had no objection to the difference at all. Maggie's place was 12 miles south and slightly west, tucked against a hillside in a way that suggested the house had grown there rather than been built, the kind of integration that took 20 years to achieve. A kitchen garden ran along the south wall in tidy rows. Chickens ranged in an enclosed yard. A small barn held 2 horses and what appeared to be, from the sounds emerging, at least one very opinionated goat. She met them at the gate and led them inside without ceremony. Cole was already there, sitting at Maggie's kitchen table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He was younger than Caleb had registered from a distance, 25 at the outside, with the kind of face that would take another decade to fully settle into itself. He stood when Clara came through the door, and the expression that moved across him was complicated relief and shame, and something that looked like it had been rehearsed and then abandoned in favor of whatever the honest version was. "Miss Whitmore," he said, then corrected himself immediately. "I heard you married. I'm sorry, Mrs. Reston." "Sit down, Cole," Clara said. She sat across from him without preamble. Caleb took a position near the wall, not threatening but present. Maggie stood by the stove with her arms folded and the expression of a woman presiding over a thing she had arranged and intended to see through. "Tell us," Clara said to Cole, "how you ended up working for my uncle." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Your father gave me my first real position," he said. I was 17. I'd had some schooling, but not enough to get anywhere on my own, and he took a chance on me. Let me do accounts work. He was a good man. Fair. He paused. When he died, I was 19 and had nowhere to go. Your uncle offered to keep me on. I thought I thought he was like your father, the same kind of man. I didn't understand for a long time that he wasn't. When did you understand? Clara asked. Cole was quiet for a moment. There were things I was asked to do that I convinced myself were normal. Document management. Correspondence that I wasn't supposed to read but did because I was the one writing it. Financial records that he stopped. The accounts, Mrs. Reston, the trust accounts from your father's estate. I'm the one who kept them. I know what went in and what came out and where it went. The room was very still. He's been taking from it, Claire said. Not a question. Yes, for years. Not all at once, carefully in amounts that were difficult to notice, unless you were looking at the full picture across the whole span. I've been looking at it for 4 years. Cole met her eyes. I have records, copies I made before I left. They're with a solicitor in Cheyenne who has instructions to file them with the appropriate federal authorities if I don't contact him by the 1st of August. He reached inside his coat and placed a folded document on the table. And I have this. Clara reached forward and unfolded it. Caleb watched her face as she read. He saw the moment she understood what she was looking at, a small controlled flinch, and then a stillness that was deeper than composure. This is my father's handwriting, she said. Yes, ma'am. It's a letter he wrote to his solicitor 6 months before he died. He was updating his will. He had concerns about his brother. He'd seen some things that worried him, and he wanted to make sure that if anything happened, there were instructions in place. Cole's voice was sturdy. Your uncle found the original before it could be properly filed. He destroyed it. But your father had sent a copy to a friend in Philadelphia, and that friend gave it to me 3 months ago when I went back east I was looking for something I could use to get out. Clara set the letter down carefully. Her hands were not shaking. Caleb noted that. What does it say? Maggie asked from across the room. Clara looked up at her. It says that my Uncle Edmund is not in fact my legal guardian as designated by my father's will. My father had changed his designation 6 months before he died. The designated guardian was a solicitor in Philadelphia named Robert Hatch. She set the letter flat on the table. Edmund Whitmore has been operating as my guardian fraudulently for 10 years. Silence. The original will was destroyed, Cole said, but this letter documents his intention to change it. Combined with the financial records, I've talked to 2 lawyers. They say it's enough to open an investigation, enough to expose what he's done. He looked at Clara directly. I didn't know when I came west with Crane whether I was going to tell you this or not. I told myself I was just doing my job. But then I saw you standing on that porch and you said, I'm not going, and you meant it so completely, and I thought, he stopped. I thought about your father, about the kind of man he was, and I couldn't. Why didn't you come to us immediately, Caleb asked, after Crane's visit? Because I wasn't sure you'd believe me, and because Crane is still watching me, I had to be careful about when and how I moved. Cole looked at Caleb. I went to Mrs. Holt because Crane doesn't know about her. He doesn't know I have any connection to this part of the county. It gave me an angle he wasn't covering. Maggie made a small sound that might have been approval. Clara looked at the letter on the table for a long moment. Then she looked at Cole. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't, he said immediately. Not automatically. I was working for the man who hurt you. I knew things I didn't act on for 4 years. I don't have a right to ask for your trust, he paused. What I'm asking is whether what I can give you is useful, whether you want it. Trust can come later if it comes. The information is real regardless. Clara looked at Caleb. He had been watching Cole throughout the particular attention of someone who had learned to read men in the compressed, pressured context of cattle drives and frontier disputes, where character revealed itself quickly because there was no social infrastructure to hide it. What he saw was a young man who was genuinely afraid and genuinely resolved in the specific combination that came from deciding to do the right thing, having understood it would cost him. He gave Clara a slight nod. She looked back at Cole. All right, she said. What do you need from us? Time, Cole said. A few days. Crane is expecting me back in Helena by Friday. If I don't show, he'll know something's wrong. I need to be able to tell him something that explains a delay without raising suspicion. He hesitated. And I need to know when this is over, when whatever happens, happens, is there somewhere I can go that isn't back to Edmund Whitmore? You can stay in the county, Maggie said from across the room with the air of someone settling a matter. I have use for a man who can keep accounts and has enough sense to choose correctly when it matters. The pay is modest and the work is not glamorous, but it's honest. Cole blinked at her. Ma'am, you don't know me. I know enough, Maggie said. I knew your father. He was a man who made the right call eventually. Apparently that runs in families. She uncrossed her arms and moved to the stove. Now, sit down all of you and eat supper. We'll plan the rest over food like civilized people. They ate at Maggie's kitchen table as the summer evening deepened around the house, roasted chicken vegetables from the garden bread that Maggie had made that morning, and which was better than anything Caleb had eaten in years. The conversation moved between the practical and the personal in the way of people who have decided for the moment to trust each other and are discovering that trust has a particular flavor, something between relief and appetite. Clara sat beside Caleb, and he was aware of her shoulder near his, the warmth of her presence, the way she leaned slightly forward when she was engaged with what someone was saying. She was more animated than he'd seen her, more herself, whatever that meant, the particular self that existed when she wasn't managing fear. On the ride home, under a sky scattered with stars she'd taught him to read, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I keep thinking about that letter. My father wrote it 6 months before he died. He was worried about Edmund. He was trying to protect me. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. He didn't succeed, but he tried. He did. I thought for a long time I thought he must not have known what Edmund was like, what he would do. I thought he wouldn't have left me there if he'd known. She paused, but he did know. He was trying to prevent it. He just ran out of time. Caleb said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. He rode close enough that their horses' sides occasionally brushed, and she didn't move away, and they went north through the summer dark toward home. She told him about the box 3 days later. He'd found her in the main room on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the table with a wooden box in front of her, small hinge, the kind used for correspondence. It had come from the back of the storage shelf above the fireplace behind an old coffee tin and some dried herbs he'd forgotten about. This was in your stores, she said when he came in from the morning chores. I was looking for the extra candle wax. I found this instead. She looked at him steadily. It has your name on the outside, and it's sealed. He crossed to the table and looked at the box. His name in handwriting he didn't immediately recognize, and a wax seal he'd never seen. I didn't put this here, he said. I know. The dust on it, it's been there a while. A year, maybe more. She paused. I almost didn't tell you. It felt private. Another pause. But I've been sitting here for 20 minutes, and I think you should open it. He sat down and broke the seal. Inside were 3 items, a folded letter, a small photograph, the formal kind taken in a studio that cost money, and a pressed wildflower that had gone brittle with age. He unfolded the letter first. The handwriting was Sarah's. He knew it immediately, though he hadn't seen it in 5 years. He'd received 4 letters from her during the time they'd been together, careful notes passed through the younger brother who'd acted as their go-between. He'd burned them all when he left Wyoming. He hadn't burned the memory of the hand that had written them. He read it without speaking. Clara sat across from him and waited with the particular quality of patience that she had, the kind that gave you room rather than pressing on it. The letter was dated 18 months ago, Caleb. I am writing this not knowing if you will ever read it, or who might find it first, or whether finding it will mean you are in a better place than when I last knew you, or a worse one. I am writing it because a mutual friend told me you had gone north and settled, and because there are things I want you to know that I have no other way of telling you. I am alive. I married the banker my father arranged, as you will have heard. His name is Gerald Forsyth, and he is a decent man, not the man I would have chosen at 22, but one who has become with time a genuine partner. We have a daughter. Her name is Margaret, and she is, I will tell you honestly, the thing that makes everything else make sense. I am not writing to cause you pain or to reopen anything that is properly closed. I am writing because I need you to understand something that I could not have said at the time and that I think you need to hear. What happened was not your fault. You were one man against my father's money and authority and decades of social standing. There was nothing you could have done that would have changed the outcome except made things worse for both of us. I have spent a great deal of time in the years since being angry at you for leaving and then understanding why you left and finally arriving at the place where I can say honestly, I forgive you. And I hope you have forgiven yourself because I know you well enough to know that you haven't. Stop punishing yourself, Caleb. Build something. You always had that in you, the ability to make something from nothing, to take a piece of land and understand what it wanted to become. Go do that and let yourself be happy if it comes to that. You're allowed. I left this with a woman who knew where you'd gone. She said she'd find a way to get it to you when the time seemed right. I trust her judgment. Take care of yourself. That's all, Sarah. He set the letter down. Clara was watching him. He looked up at her and found in her expression neither pity nor discomfort, just attention, the honest attention of someone who was present with him in whatever this was. She's alive, Clara said quietly. And well. Yes. His voice was strange to him, rougher than he expected. She wrote to tell you it wasn't your fault. Yes. Clara looked at the letter on the table. Maggie left it here, she said. That's who the woman who knew where you'd gone is. Maggie knew your story. A pause, Fionn. She was waiting for the right time. He thought about Maggie's hawk eyes and her habit of knowing things she hadn't been told. He thought about the timing, the letter arriving, or being placed around the time he'd answered the agency advertisement. He thought about Maggie's comment when she'd first come to the ranch. I know things about the county that would surprise you. She was waiting until I gave her reason to think I was ready, he said. Yes. Clara met his eyes across the table. Are you all right? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. 5 years of carrying a shape of guilt that had been built around an incomplete understanding. 5 years of a story with pieces missing. And now the missing pieces and the story reordering itself and the weight of it not gone but altered. Changed in its quality, if not its mass. I think, he said slowly, that I have been punishing myself for something that didn't require quite that degree of punishment. I think that too, she said. Carefully, I think I've been making myself small because I thought I'd made myself large in the wrong ways. Caleb, she leaned forward slightly, you chose to help me, a stranger with trouble behind her and no guarantee of anything. You did that on the same day you got off the stage from feeling like a coward. It wasn't entirely selfless. I know, redemption rarely is. That doesn't make it less real. She folded her hands on the table. What are you going to do with it? The guilt, I mean, now that you know. He looked at the letter. At the photographed Sarah in a formal dress, upright and composed, and beside her a man with a kind face, and between them a small girl who appeared to have inherited her mother's expression of determined self-possession. Let it go, I think, he said, or start letting it go. I suspect it doesn't happen all at once. No, Clara said. It doesn't. She was quiet for a moment. I'm still letting mine go. The shame of having stayed so long, of not getting out sooner, of sometimes thinking that maybe if I'd been different, behaved differently. She stopped. It's not rational. I know it's not rational, but it doesn't respond to rational arguments. No, he agreed. It doesn't. They sat in the morning quiet with Sarah's letter between them, and the unsaid things gathered in the room with a specific gravity, and Caleb found himself thinking that this was what it meant to actually know someone, not the surface performance of knowing, not the social exchange, but this sitting in the difficult places together without flinching. Clara, he said. Yes. I need to tell you something. She waited. When Crane said, when he mentioned the married status, the guardianship transfer, he met her eyes. I've been thinking about it, not the legal logic of it, the other part. She was very still. I think you know what I mean, he said. I think I do, she said carefully. I'm not asking right now, he said. There's too much happening, and I don't want it tangled up with all of it. I don't want you to agree to something because of Edmund Whitmore. He held her gaze. But I want you to know that the question exists, that I'm not only thinking about the practical solution. A long moment, her hands flat on the table, the letter between them. I know, she said. I've known for a while. A pause. I need a little more time. Not because I'm unsure of what I want, because I want to want it cleanly, without the fear making the decision for me. That's exactly the right reason. You're not going to push. I'm going to plant tomatoes and mend fence and wait, he said, like any sensible man would. The ghost of a smile. You're not sensible. You said so yourself. I'm learning. She picked up Sarah's letter and held it out to him. He took it and folded it and put it carefully in his shirt pocket next to his heart, which was a thing he'd have mocked in another man and didn't question in himself. Outside, the summer morning was moving toward noon. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done. They got up from the table and went to do it. The news arrived on a Wednesday, and it came from two directions at once. The first came through Cole, who had spent the intervening weeks maintaining his cover with Crane while funneling information to Maggie through a system of relayed messages that she had designed with the quiet confidence of someone who had been doing this longer than anyone knew. Edmund Whitmore was no longer waiting in Boston. He had boarded a westbound train 10 days ago. He was in Chicago as of last week. He was coming. The second piece of news came from Clara herself on the same Wednesday morning, delivered quietly and without drama, because that was how she had come to do most things. I'm late, she said. They were at breakfast, the morning light coming through the east window in long bars of gold. More than 3 weeks. Caleb set down his coffee cup. I thought it might be the stress, she said, her voice steady with the particular effort of keeping it steady. And then I thought it might not be. She looked at him across the table. I'm not certain, but I think I might know. The room was very still around them. How do you feel, he managed. Frightened, she said honestly, and glad, in that order and also simultaneously. She folded her hands in her lap. I know the timing is, I know it's complicated, with everything else happening. The timing, Caleb said slowly, is what it is. He looked at her across the table in the morning light and thought about everything that had happened in the months since a stagecoach had pulled into Benson Creek trailing dust. He thought about choices and their consequences and the particular arithmetic of lives that touched and changed each other. If it's true, he said, then we deal with it, the same way we've dealt with everything. Together, she said, together. She looked at her hands. Edmund is coming. I know. Cole's message. Then we're running out of time. She looked up at him. Caleb, I don't want the fear to make this decision, but I also don't want to wait so long that the decision gets made for us. She held his gaze with the steadiness that he had come to understand was not an absence of fear, but its active opposite courage, being not the lack of it, but the choice made in spite of it. If you're still asking, if that question is still there. It's still there, he said. It's been there since approximately the second day you were here. Something crossed her face, surprise, and then the expression beneath surprise, which was relief so profound, it was almost grief. Then I'm saying yes, she said, not because of Edmund, not because of what might be happening. She was very precise about it, and he understood why. Because of the creek, because of the stars, because you read my books and don't say so, because you waited. She paused. Is that enough reason? He stood up from the table and crossed to where she sat and took her hands in his, and she looked up at him from the chair with those dark green eyes that he had been trying very hard not to drown in for months. That's more than enough, he said. That's everything. She stood and the morning light caught them both, and she put her head against his shoulder, and he held her carefully the way you hold something that has come through difficult weather and arrived intact and extraordinary, and outside the summer world went about its business around a small cabin in a Montana valley where two people had quietly against considerable odds found each other. We should go to town, she said after a while. Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. Tomorrow, he said. We go tomorrow. She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were bright. And today, he said, we send word to Maggie. And then we plant the rest of the bean starts you've been meaning to get in. She laughed, the real one, the surprised one, and he filed the sound away in the place where he kept the things he intended to keep. All right, she said, beans first, then the rest of our lives. That, he said, sounds exactly right. They rode into Benson Creek the next morning under a sky that couldn't decide between cloud and sun, the light shifting in long, sweeping changes across the grassland as they went. Clara wore the blue calico, the same dress she'd arrived in mended now, and clean, which he thought might be deliberate. Caleb wore his white shirt. Neither of them remarked on these choices. The town was midweek quiet, a dog sleeping in the shade outside Haggerty's store, Timothy Brooks on his usual perch at the water trough, who watched them ride in with the bright attention of someone who collected events the way other people collected coins. Morris at the territorial office looked up from his ledger. When they came through the door, took in Caleb's shirt and Clara's dress and the particular quality of two people who have made a decision and are prepared to live inside it. Walker, he said, then corrected Reston. This the lady from Spring. This is Clara Whitmore, Caleb said. We're here to get married. Morris blinked, then he reached for a different ledger. Well, he said, that's direct. License first, Caleb asked. License first, $2. Then you need an officiant. Reverend Park is in today. I saw him at the post office not an hour ago. Morris was already writing. He's agreeable about short notice if you explain the circumstances. We'll find him, Clara said. Morris looked at her over the top of his ledger with the assessing expression of a man who had watched this town for 20 years and knew the difference between women who had been pressed into decisions and women who had made them. Whatever he saw appeared to satisfy him. He stamped the license with more ceremony than the situation strictly required and handed it across the counter. They found Reverend Park at the boarding house taking his mid-morning coffee, a thin, careful man with the hands of someone who had done physical work before finding his calling, who looked at them both with the gentle thoroughness of a man accustomed to understanding the real shape of situations beneath their presented surfaces. He spoke to Clara privately the way Judge Carrill would have done in the original story. Caleb waited on the boarding house porch and watched the street and thought about the day Clara had stepped off the stage into this same town and the distance between that morning and this one. The distance was not only time. When Clara came back out, she was followed by Park, who was already reaching for his hat. Let's get this done, Park said pleasantly, as though performing a wedding on 20 minutes' notice was entirely routine, which for a frontier minister it largely was. They married in the street outside the territorial office because it was the most official-looking location available. Morris served as witness. The blacksmith Hennessy was pulled from his forge again and bore it with better grace than one might have expected from a man interrupted mid-weld. Park moved through the ceremony with a quiet dignity that gave it more weight than its brevity, suggested he understood Caleb thought that the words mattered even when the circumstances were unconventional. Do you, Caleb James Reston, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife to have and to hold in all the days and circumstances that come? I do. Do you, Clara Ann Whitmore, take this man as your lawfully wedded husband to have and to hold freely and of your own choosing? I do. Her voice was clear and level and entirely certain. Then by the authority vested in me by the Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. He kissed her carefully, aware of the watching street, aware of Timothy Brooks making mental notes at high speed from the water trough. Clara's hands came up and held his lapels, and the kiss was brief, but it said everything the ceremony had been working toward. When they separated, her eyes were bright and her chin was up, and she looked, he thought, like someone who had just won something she hadn't entirely expected to want. Well, Morris said behind them, congratulations. I'll file this properly. He paused. And for what it's worth, Walker Reston, I've watched you live like a man trying to disappear for 5 years. Glad to see you've stopped. Caleb shook his hand. Appreciate it, Bill. Chen from the boarding house had appeared as she seemed to appear whenever anything notable was occurring in Benson Creek and refused to let them leave without coffee and cake, which she produced from somewhere with the efficiency of a woman who kept cake in reserve for exactly this category of occasion. She fussed over Clara with the specific warmth of someone who recognized in the woman in front of her a quality worth fussing over. You need anything? Mrs. Chen told Clara, pressing her hand. You come here. Anytime. That man of yours has been alone too long. He needs someone to tell him when he's being an idiot. I expect you're qualified. I'm developing the skill, Clara said. The ride home was different from the ride in. Something had been resolved. They were quieter, but it was the quiet of people who had settled something rather than avoided it, and there was a lightness to it underneath, not frivolous, but genuine. Clara held the marriage certificate across her lap with both hands, studying it occasionally as though checking that it was still real. How do you feel? He asked somewhere along the northern road where the grassland opened up and the mountains came fully into view. She considered it with the seriousness she brought to actual questions. Like I can breathe more deeply than I could this morning, she said. Like something that was waiting for permission has been given it. She looked at him. How do you feel? Like I should have done this about 6 weeks ago. She laughed. We weren't ready 6 weeks ago. You think so? I know so. 6 weeks ago, I was still waiting for the trap. She looked at the certificate again. Now I'm just here. Present. This is actually my life. She said it with a quality of wonder that was not performed. I'm not running away from something. I'm arriving at something in. He thought that was the most accurate description of both their situations that he had yet heard. They sent word to Maggie that evening and went to sleep in the same room for the first time in the bed he had been sleeping in the loft to avoid for months. And it was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, and outside the valley was dark and quiet and entirely theirs. Edmund Whitmore arrived in Benson Creek on a Monday. Caleb heard about it from Maggie, who heard it from Mrs. Chen, who had a talent for information that rivaled Maggie's own. He came with Victor Crane, a lawyer named Aldous Pemberton, who had traveled from Chicago with the specific bearing of someone expensive, and two men who wore guns in a way that said they were not decorative. Cole sent a message through Maggie's relay. He has a new document, federal jurisdiction, not territorial, incompetency filing. He found a judge in Chicago to sign it. He doesn't know yet that you're married. Caleb read this at the kitchen table while Clara stood at the window looking at the valley. She'd been quieter since the news of Edmund's arrival, not frightened precisely, but pulled inward, doing the kind of interior work that didn't show on the surface. He'll come here, she said without turning. Yes. He won't come alone. No, he has Crane and a lawyer and two men who are armed. She turned from the window. The morning light was behind her and he couldn't quite read her face. Caleb, I need you to let me handle this. He was quiet for a moment. Handle it how? I need to be the one who talks to him. Not because I don't want your help, I do. I need you there. But he's never in his life had to answer to me. He has always been able to speak around me, over me, past me, as though I weren't a coherent party to my own situation. She came to the table and sat across from him. I need him to see that that's over, and he'll only see it if it comes from me. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze with the steady, unrelinquishing attention that she'd been building since the day she stepped off that stage, built up from nothing day by day until it was load-bearing. All right, he said. You stand behind me, she said. Literally if you want, but you let me speak. I'll let you speak. She nodded and looked at her hands on the table. I spent 10 years learning how he works, how he frames things, how he moves the ground under your feet until you're arguing about something other than what you started arguing about. She paused. I know every one of his methods. He's never had to face someone who did. He's about to buy him, Caleb said. She almost smiled. Yes, he is. They sent word to Maggie, who sent word to Cole, and the preparations they made were quiet and thorough and without drama. Sheriff Dale Norris, who had been watching this situation with the cautious attention of a man who wanted to stay ahead of whatever was coming, agreed to be present. Maggie would bring the documents Cole had gathered. Cole himself would be there. They did not have long to wait. Edmund Whitmore arrived at the ranch on Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock, which told Caleb something about the man. He came at a civilized hour in full daylight, with the confidence of someone who expected the transaction to go smoothly. He rode in a hired buggy that looked absurd on the ranch road, flanked by Crane on horseback and the two armed men behind. Pemberton, the lawyer, was in the buggy beside him. Caleb was in the yard when they came over the rise. Clara was on the porch. Sheriff Norris stood near the corral gate with the careful neutrality of an official observer. Maggie's horse was hitched at the far side of the barn, which meant she was already inside. She had arrived an hour earlier quietly through the back. Cole was somewhere he could be called, but couldn't be seen. That had been his suggestion. Edmund Whitmore stepped down from the buggy, and Caleb looked at him for the first time and understood, in the particular way you understand things you had previously only known, what Clara had endured. He was not physically a frightening man. He was perhaps 60, well-dressed in the Eastern manner, with silver hair and the kind of face that photographed well-composed, authoritative, projecting competence and social standing. He looked like someone whose opinions were usually attended to. He looked like a man who had always gotten what he came for and had ceased to question whether he deserved it. His eyes found Clara on the porch, and something moved through them. Not warmth, not relief, not any of the emotions a guardian might feel upon locating a missing ward. Just the flat assessing calculation of someone taking stock of an asset and determining its current condition. Clara, he said, his voice was cultivated, measured, designed to project reasonable concern. You gave us quite a scare. Edmund, she said. Her voice was level. She did not move from the porch. He looked around the yard with the expression of someone cataloging an environment and finding it beneath discussion. His eyes moved to Caleb, then to Norris, then back to Clara. Pemberton had climbed down from the buggy and was opening a leather case with the practiced calm of a man who spent his life unfolding bad news for other people. We've come a long way, Edmund said. I think you know why. I know why you think you've come, Clara said. I'd like you to hear why you're actually here before Mr. Pemberton opens that case. A small pause. Pemberton paused. Edmund's expression adjusted almost imperceptibly, a micro-correction, the recalibration of a man who had encountered something unexpected in the first exchange. By all means, he said with the magnanimous patience of someone who was very certain of his ground. Clara came down the porch steps. Not quickly, deliberately, each step placed with intention. She stopped at the bottom and looked at her uncle across the yard with the full weight of 10 years of knowledge behind her eyes. You've brought a lawyer and a document, she said. I assume it's the incompetency filing, the affidavit from Dr. Marsh in Boston, who examined me for approximately 8 minutes in 1878 and found me to be of questionable stability. She said it with a precision that visibly surprised him. I know about the affidavit, Edmund. I found the draft in your desk. Edmund's expression hadn't changed. He was too practiced for that. But something in his posture had shifted by a millimeter. Clara, you've clearly been under a great deal of stress. That's exactly why we're concerned. I'm married, she said. Silence. Pemberton's hand had stopped moving over the leather case. I beg your pardon, Edmund said. I've been married for 4 days. Clara's voice was entirely steady. To Caleb Reston, performed by Reverend Park in Benson Creek, witnessed and filed with the Territorial Office. I'm no longer subject to your guardianship under any jurisdiction. The incompetency filing is directed at a woman who is now a married adult with a husband who holds any relevant legal standing. She paused. You've wasted a great deal of travel time. Edmund looked at Caleb. His expression had moved from controlled authority to something colder and more pointed. This marriage is almost certainly fraudulent, he said, entered into under coercion. Sheriff, Caleb said quietly. Norris stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, I've spoken with both parties to this marriage on separate occasions consistent with standard procedure. Mrs. Reston has affirmed her free consent on the record. I'll be happy to provide you with that documentation. A territorial sheriff's word against a federal. Edmund. Clara's voice cut through cleanly, not raised, not sharp, simply exact. Stop, he stopped. And in the stopping, Caleb saw it, the thing that Clara had described, the thing she'd spent 10 years navigating. Edmund Whitmore was not accustomed to being told to stop by Clara Whitmore. The adjustment required was visible in his face for just a moment before he controlled it again. There are other matters, Pemberton said, recovering smoothly. The question of the trust, of the guardianship administration. Mr. Whitmore has acted consistently with his legal mandate and is prepared to provide full accounting. I'm glad to hear it, Clara said, because there's someone here who would like to discuss that accounting. She turned slightly and said at a normal volume, Cole. James Cole came around the corner of the barn. The effect on Edmund Whitmore was immediate and specific. Not dramatic, he did not flinch or recoil. But the color of his face changed, and his eyes did something involuntary, and Caleb understood that whatever Cole represented to him, it was not a minor complication. Cole walked across the yard with the measured tread of someone who had decided what he was going to do and was past the point of reconsidering it. He stopped a few feet from Pemberton and looked at Edmund Whitmore with the expression of a young man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was putting it down. Mr. Whitmore, he said, I left your employment 3 weeks ago. I thought you should know directly. Cole. Edmund's voice had lost some of its cultivated smoothness. Not much. A fraction. Whatever you think I have copies, Cole said, of the trust account ledgers from 1872 to present. I have copies of the correspondence regarding the Hargrove property transfer and the Maritime Consolidated Withdrawal and the Belfield notes. He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheaf of papers. And I have a letter signed by William Whitmore, Clara's father, dated 6 months before his death, in which he states his intention to change his legal designee for guardianship of his daughter and his reasons for doing so. Pemberton had gone very still. That letter is not legally, Edmund began. It's not the original will, Cole agreed. The original will was destroyed. You destroyed it. You'd have a witness to that, a clerk from Whitmore and Associates who came forward last month. He set the papers on the fence rail beside him. What it is combined with the financial records is enough for a federal investigation. I've already spoken with the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne. They're expecting a full submission by the end of the month. The yard was very quiet. Edmund Whitmore looked at Cole. He looked at the papers on the fence rail. He looked at Clara, the full weight of his attention, the particular qualities she had described to Caleb as the thing she had feared most. The look that said, "You belong to me, and you will learn that eventually." He aimed it at her with the precision of long practice. Clara looked back at him. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She stood in the yard of the ranch she had helped build in the morning light of a life she had chosen, and she held his gaze with the steady, unrelinquishing attention of someone who knew exactly who she was. Edmund Whitmore looked away first. It was a small thing, a fractional shift of the eyes, a redirecting toward Pemberton. But Caleb saw it, and Maggie saw it from the barn doorway, where she had appeared silently, and Clara saw it, and in the seeing of it, something shifted irreversibly. "Pemberton," Edmund said. His voice was still controlled, only barely. "Sir," Pemberton said carefully, "I think we may want to, given the information presented, consider our options before proceeding." A long silence. "The accounts," Edmund said finally, "can be explained." "Perhaps," Pemberton said, "but perhaps this is a conversation better had with our own counsel present in a more appropriate setting." He was Caleb, recognized a lawyer, watching the ground shift and maneuvering to get his client off it before they sank. "We should discuss." "There is nothing to discuss here." Edmund's voice had recovered its authority, but it had the quality now of a performance rather than a natural state, effortful, maintained. He looked at Clara one more time. "You have made choices," he said. "You will live with them." "I intend to," she said, "for a very long time." He turned and walked back to the buggy. Crane met Caleb's eyes across the yard as he turned his horse. There was nothing in the look, no acknowledgement, no conclusion. He was a professional who had been on the losing side of something and was moving on to the next engagement. The two armed men followed. Pemberton closed his leather case with a click that sounded like punctuation. The buggy went back over the rise and was gone. The yard held its silence for a moment. Then Sheriff Norris let out a long breath and took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Well," he said, "that was something." Cole sat down on the fence rail beside his papers and looked like a man who had been holding himself very straight for a very long time and could now afford to be slightly less upright. Maggie came out of the barn doorway and walked across the yard to Clara and took both her hands and held them and said nothing, which was precisely right. Clara turned to Caleb. He crossed the yard to her. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. He put his arms around her and she leaned into him, and he felt the long, controlled trembling of a woman whose body was releasing something she had been holding tightly for 10 years. "It's over," he said quietly against her hair. "Not quite," she said muffled against his chest. Cole said, "The investigation." "Clara." "Yes, for today, for this morning, it's over." A pause, then, "Yes," she said, "it is." The weeks that followed were busy in the way of things that had been held in suspension and are now permitted to move. Cole's submission to the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne was filed on schedule. The solicitor in that city who had been holding the corroborating documents released them as planned. The federal investigation into Edmund Whitmore's administration of the Whitmore Estate Trust was opened formally in September. Pemberton withdrew from the matter entirely, which was Cole explained what expensive lawyers did when they realized the ground they were standing on was not load-bearing. Edmund Whitmore returned to Boston. Caleb heard this from Norris, who had maintained a quiet line of communication with the marshal's office out of professional courtesy, and something that resembled at a discreet distance care for the situation he had watched develop in his county. The marriage was never challenged. The incompetency filing was quietly dropped. Without a guardian and with a husband, Clara was simply a married woman in the Montana Territory, which was a legal category sufficiently ordinary as to be uninteresting to most courts. Howard Finch wrote a letter of congratulation that was warm in a way that suggested the formal language of the matrimonial business had not entirely contained the man behind it. He mentioned with what seemed like genuine satisfaction that the Whitmore case had resulted in changes to the agency's intake protocols for women fleeing domestic danger, that Clara's situation had made something better for women who came after. She read that letter twice and put it carefully in the box where she kept the things that mattered. Cole stayed. Maggie had been serious about the work she'd offered him, and he turned out to be exactly what she'd claimed to have seen in him: thorough, honest, capable of the particular courage required to do the right thing, having understood the cost. He came for supper at the ranch once a month, and the dynamic between him and Clara had the specific quality of people who shared a past they hadn't chosen and were choosing to make something better of it. On a Thursday morning in late August, Caleb and Clara rode to Benson Creek together to see Dr. Hayes, who confirmed what Clara had already known, what they had both already known, in the way you know some things before any outside authority confirms them. Hayes was a practical man with 20 years of frontier medicine behind him. He examined Clara, made his notes, and gave Caleb the look that men gave other men in these moments, a look that contained congratulations and caution in the particular respect due to anyone about to attempt something difficult and necessary. February, Hayes said. Late February or early March. Everything looks healthy. She's strong. He looked at Clara. You'll want someone with experience present for the birth. The road to town can be unpredictable in February. Maggie Holt, Clara said immediately. Hayes nodded. Good choice. On the ride home, Clara held the mare's reins loosely and was quiet in a way that was not troubled, but full occupied with something interior that she was working through at her own pace. Caleb rode beside her and didn't push. Are you frightened? He asked somewhere along the northern road. Yes, she said. The good kind, the kind that means something real is happening. She paused. My mother died when I was 12. I don't know how she was. I don't know if this is something that runs in a family. She was quiet for a moment. I wish I could ask her. What would you ask? She thought about it. Whether it gets easier, being responsible for someone new, someone who doesn't know anything yet and needs to be taught how to exist in the world. She looked at the mountains. I think I'd be good at that part. The teaching. I've spent 10 years learning things I shouldn't have had to learn. I know what children need to be protected from, what they need to be given. She looked at him. Is that strange? Thinking about what I know how to give before thinking about what I'm afraid I can't. No, he said. That's the right way around. She rode quietly for a while. Then, I want to name her Rose if she's a girl. Her. She's a girl, I'm certain of it, or that. Clara looked at him with a directness that he had learned not to argue with when she was certain of something. Rose, my mother's middle name. Rose Reston, he said, letting the syllables settle. All right, and if you're wrong, then we'll think of something and never speak of this again. He almost smiled. Deal. She reached across the space between the horses and took his hand for a moment, brief, warm, deliberate, and then let go and rode ahead of him on the easier ground where the track widened, and he followed her home. Autumn came in quickly that year, as though summer had looked at the calendar and decided it was done. The aspens on the north boundary turned golden all at once over 3 days in late September, and the mornings carried a cold that was not hostile but honest, and the cattle began their slow drift toward the lower pastures where the shelter was better. Clara's pregnancy became undeniable in October, not just to their eyes, but to the visible awareness of Benson Creek, which registered the development with the quiet satisfaction of a small community accumulating evidence that things were continuing as they should. Mrs. Chen made her a gift of 2 flannel nightgowns and refused payment. Norris tipped his hat with more ceremony than usual when he passed them on the street. Even Morris at the territorial office, whose relationship with sentiment was professionally minimal, allowed himself a brief approving nod. She was, Caleb thought, magnificent. Not in any conventional presentation of femininity sense, though she was that too, the specific beauty of a woman whose face had healed fully and who moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. He meant something else. She carried the pregnancy the way she carried everything, with attention and without complaint, adapting her work as her body changed, without treating the adaptation as defeat. She remained exact and capable, and interested in everything and infuriatingly right about most things she had opinions in, which was most things. He told her she was magnificent once on a November evening when they were sitting by the fire and she had fallen asleep over a book and woken to find him watching her. "What?" she said, slightly foggy with interrupted sleep. "Nothing," he said. "You're magnificent." She blinked at him. Then she closed the book and said, "You're the strangest man I have ever met," with the affectionate precision of someone who means it as the highest compliment, and went back to sleep. He sat with the fire and the dark outside and thought about what it was to have arrived at this, at a life that had shape and warmth and weight, that was anchored at both ends, and the middle that could be described as a life rather than its absence. He thought about what he would have missed if he hadn't gone to that stage on that Friday morning in May. He didn't let himself think about it for long. Some things didn't benefit from extended contemplation. The news from the federal investigation came in November through Cole, who had maintained his contact with the marshal's office through Maggie's relay. Edmund Whitmore had agreed to a settlement rather than face a full trial. The accounts were to be audited and restitution calculated, a process that would take months and would likely result in considerably less than full recovery. A partial return of what had been taken. Not justice in the complete sense, but the version of justice that was available. Clara read Cole's message at the kitchen table and folded it quietly. "It won't be everything," she said. "No, it's something." She set the folded paper on the table. "My father's estate. Whatever remains of it, it'll come to us." She looked up. "I want to use it for the ranch, for building this properly." She paused. Is that all right? To bring money from that into this?" He looked at her steadily. "It was always yours. Your parents left it to you. You've more than earned the right to decide what becomes of it. But the ranch is yours." "Ours," he said, "has been since about the third day." She looked at him for a moment, and then something gave way in her expression. Not breaking down, but releasing a tension she'd been holding about this specifically. The money and what it meant. The question of whether it would change the arithmetic of what they were. "Ours," she agreed, "and I was thinking," he said, "that we should name the place. Something proper. Something that means what it is." She looked at him with the expression that meant she was already 3 steps ahead. "Second chances," she said. He nodded. "Second chances ranch." She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them, and then looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with something that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite not. "That's exactly right," she said. Maggie arrived in the 3rd week of January with a mom packed for an extended stay and the air of a woman who had made decisions and was not entertaining alternatives. "February is unpredictable," she said, handing her horse to Caleb at the gate. "I'd rather be here 2 weeks early than 2 hours late." Clara was by this point moving through the cabin with the careful, deliberate navigation of someone who had learned the precise geography of every obstacle in a space she could no longer see past her own belly. She greeted Maggie at the door with the particular combination of relief and pride that she brought to all assistance. She accepted, grateful for it, unwilling to pretend she hadn't managed without it. The 2 women occupied the domestic space together with a naturalness that Caleb had stopped being surprised by. They talked while they worked, Clara cooking, while Maggie organized the supplies. She'd brought medical things alongside food, herbs, alongside bandages, and the conversation moved between practical matters and the kind of stories that get told when women are preparing for something significant together. Caleb moved in and out of the cabin, attending to his own work, and caught fragments. Maggie's account of births she'd attended over 20 years, Clara's questions that were specific and unafraid, Maggie's answers that gave real information rather than reassurance. "You're not going to tell me not to worry," Clara observed one evening when Caleb was at the table within earshot. "No," Maggie said. "Worry is sensible. It means you're paying attention. What I'll tell you is that worrying and panicking are different things, and one of them is useful." "Which one?" "I think you know." "Worry keeps you sharp," Clara said. "Panic makes you stupid." "Correct." Maggie looked satisfied. "You'll be fine." The baby announced herself on a Tuesday night in the 1st week of February. Clara woke Caleb at 2 in the morning with a hand on his arm and the quiet authority of someone who had been awake for an hour, already timing things, being certain before she woke anyone. "It's time," she said. He was out of bed before he was fully awake, pulling on his trousers, reaching for the lamp. Maggie was already at the door of the second room. She slept light as people did who had spent decades being the person summoned in the night. How far apart? Maggie asked. 8 minutes when I started counting. Maybe 6 now. Maggie nodded with the satisfied authority of a woman whose estimates had been confirmed. Then we have time to do this properly. Caleb, water on all of it. Clara, come with me. He did what he was told. He built the fire higher and put every pot he owned on the stove and tried to be useful in the specific manner of a man whose usefulness was currently being redirected toward logistics rather than presence. He brought in wood, he boiled water. He was efficient and steady and absolutely terrified in the clean, uncomplicated way of someone who understands exactly what is at stake and cannot control any of it. Maggie kept the bedroom door open. She was not the kind of woman who believed men should be kept decoratively ignorant of what happened on the other side of that door, but she was also practical about what was helpful and what was not. And what was helpful right now was Caleb maintaining the fire and the water supply and being within earshot when Clara needed to hear his voice. Caleb, Clara called at one point some hours in. He was at the door immediately. Just stay close, she said. Her voice was strained but controlled. You don't have to come in. Just stay close. I'm here, he said. I know. A pause through something. I know, that's what I needed. He sat on the floor outside the bedroom door for the next 2 hours, with his back against the wall and his knees up and his eyes open, listening to the sounds from inside, and Maggie's voice giving directions and Clara's voice responding, and the specific quality of effort that had no adequate parallel in any other human experience. The baby cried at 4:15 in the morning. The sound was extraordinary, high and fierce and indignant and entirely real, a new voice in the world announcing itself without apology. Caleb pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and sat with it for a moment. Then Maggie opened the door. Come in, she said. Both of them are asking for you in their own ways. He came in. Clara was propped against the pillows with her hair loose and her face sheened with the work of the last hours, and she looked like someone who had just done something enormous and knew it. In her arms was a bundle wrapped in the soft flannel that had been warming by the fire, and from the bundle came a face so new it seemed impossible, red and scrunched and already moving, already demanding, already entirely herself. Hello, Caleb said to both of them, because there were two people in this room who hadn't been there before. She's here, Clara said. Her voice had a quality he had never heard from her before, not the steadiness of someone managing something, not the precision of someone being careful, but the pure, uncomplicated fullness of someone who is exactly where they are. He crossed to the bed and sat beside her and looked at his daughter. She was, he thought, the most astonishing thing he had ever seen. He had no adequate framework for it. He had seen calves born and foals and all ordinary miracles of ranch life, and none of it had prepared him for this specific, unrepeatable arrival. Rose, Clara said. Rose, he agreed. The baby consulted on the subject, made a sound that was neither agreement nor objection, but seemed to suggest she was reserving judgment until she had more information, which struck him as entirely reasonable. He took her carefully when Clara offered the specific terror and privilege of holding someone new, and she was lighter than he'd expected, and heavier both at once in the way that significant things always are. She blinked at him with eyes that were not yet focused and found her way eventually to his face and appeared to consider it with the neutral thoroughness of someone meeting a new circumstance. Hello, he said again very quietly to her specifically this time. I'm your father. We've been getting ready for you. Maggie from the doorway said something about checking on the water and left them, which was exactly right. Outside, the February dark was beginning to gray toward dawn. The valley was still. No storm, no wind, just the particular quiet of a winter night completing itself and a new day beginning at its own unhurried pace. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. He shifted Rose to one arm and put the other around his wife and felt the weight of them both, the specific, irreplaceable weight of people who were his and whom he was. Second Chances Ranch, Clara said softly, the words a little blurred with exhaustion. Second Chances Ranch, he agreed. We did it. You did most of it. She said firmly, and he did not argue because she was right. They sat there as the dark outside turned slowly to the pale gray of first light, and Rose slept in his arms with the total commitment of someone who has just expended considerable energy arriving at a destination, and Clara drifted in and out at his shoulder, and Maggie moved quietly in the next room, doing necessary things in the manner of someone for whom the necessary and the good were the same category. At some point, the sun came up. Spring came to the valley the way it always did, not all at once, but in accumulation, day by day, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes while the grassland below greened in advancing waves. The cottonwoods leafed out. The creek ran high with snowmelt and clear as glass in the afternoons when the light came from the west. The wildflowers started cautious at first and then extravagant, covering the lower slopes in the colors that Clara had learned to name over the months she'd been here. Rose was 2 months old and had opinions about most things. She expressed these opinions with a clarity and volume that suggested she had inherited her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness in equal and inconvenient measure. She had dark hair that was beginning to curl at the ends and eyes that had settled into a green that was neither Clara's complicated dark green nor Caleb's gray, but something between in its own, a clear light color that changed with the light. She was everyone who came within range felt compelled to note remarkable. Mrs. Chen said so. Maggie said so with the restraint of someone who said what she meant, rather than more than she meant, which made it carry more weight. Sheriff Norris said so in the gruff, indirect manner of a man whose emotional range was professionally constrained. Cole said so with the simple directness of someone learning late that the direct version of a true thing was almost always the best version. Cole had over the winter become something that did not have an exact name, not friend, not employee, not family, but some combination of those things that the frontier had its own ways of producing. He helped with calving season when the work was more than 2 people could manage. He had quietly and without announcement begun to learn ranching from the ground up in the spare hours Maggie didn't require of him, and he had the specific aptitude of someone who has spent years working with numbers and finds to his surprise that he also knows how to work with his hands. The restitution from the federal investigation came through in March less than the full amount as Cole had predicted, but considerably more than nothing. It arrived as a bank draft that Clara held in both hands at the kitchen table and looked at for a long time. "It's not what was taken," she said. "No, but it's something." She set the draft down. "My father's shipping business, some of what was recovered came from records they found of that. He built something real. Edmund took it apart and spent it, but it was real." She looked at the draft, then at Caleb. "I want to use part of this to improve the cattle operation. New stock from down south, better bloodlines. Improve the spring output. That's a good use. And part of it for a proper kitchen addition. The space we have is, I love it, but it's small for 3 people and whatever comes after 3 people. He looked at her. She looked at him with the expression that said she had considered something and was presenting her conclusion. "We have time to discuss whatever comes after 3 people, he said carefully. "We have time," she agreed. "I'm not suggesting a timeline. I'm suggesting that we build for the future we want rather than just the present we have." She folded her hands on the table. "That's all. That," he said, is a good principle." She smiled, the full one, not the controlled half-smile she'd arrived with, but the one that had been growing since May, the one that started in her eyes and moved out from there. "Good," she said. "I thought so." They began the kitchen addition in April when the ground was soft enough to dig foundation and the nights were reliable enough to leave material outside. Cole came on weekends to help. Maggie came once with architectural opinions, which were not modest and which resulted in a slightly larger window than originally planned and a built-in shelf along the north wall that turned out to be exactly right. Clara directed from the porch with Rose on her hip, managing the baby with one arm and pointing out structural decisions with the other, and Caleb built what she indicated and found that the resulting structure was better than what he would have built alone. This seemed to him an accurate description of most things. On an evening in late April, when the new walls were framed and the days were long enough to sit on the porch after supper and watch the last of the light leave the sky, Clara brought Rose outside and sat beside him, and they watched the valley go from gold to amber to the deep blue of early dark. Rose was awake and engaged with the world in the specific way of 2-month-olds not understanding any of it, but paying attention to all of it, her head moving to follow light and sound and the inexhaustible interest of new things. "I keep thinking about the morning I arrived," Clara said. "Do you, my way?" The stagecoach, stepping down into the street. She looked at the valley. I was so certain I knew what was going to happen. I had the whole thing mapped out in my head, a practical arrangement, a house in exchange for labor, the minimum necessary warmth to survive. And instead, someone asked me if I was hurt anywhere else. She paused. That was the first thing you said. Not hello, not welcome, not any of the things people say. You asked if I was hurt anywhere else. She turned to look at him. I didn't know what to do with that. It was such an odd question, such a specific kind of attention. I wanted to know. I know that now. She shifted Rose slightly, who complained at the rearrangement, and then settled. I think I've been trying to pay that back, offer the same kind of attention, the specific kind that actually sees. You have, he said. I want to keep doing it. She looked at their daughter, to her especially, to see her specifically, not the idea of her or what I need her to be her, whatever she turns out to be. She's going to be a lot, Caleb said. Yes, Clara agreed with visible satisfaction. She really is. They sat in the spring evening with the day ending around them and the new walls of the kitchen addition catching the last light and the valley doing what valleys do, holding everything in it, indifferent and beautiful. The mountains beyond keeping their patient watch over all the small human urgencies below. Rose made a sound that was somewhere between question and announcement. I know, Clara told her. We'll go in soon. It's getting cold. Rose considered this information and appeared to reserve judgment. She gets that from you, Caleb said. She gets everything from me. The stubbornness, particularly the stubbornness, Clara agreed entirely without apology. He laughed and she laughed, and Rose, startled by this bilateral outbreak, looked between them with the expression of someone who suspects something interesting is happening and intends to investigate further when her faculties allow. They went inside. The fire was still going, banked low but warm, and the lamp on the table threw its familiar light over the room, over the shelf where Clara's 3 books stood beside the Shakespeare, over the pegs on the wall where their coats hung together, over the table where they had eaten 1,000 meals since May and would eat 1,000 more, over the cradle in the corner that Caleb had built in the winter and that Rose had occupied since February, with the proprietary confidence of someone who understood that this space had been made specifically for her. Caleb lit a second lamp, and Clara fed Rose, and the fire settled into its evening rhythm, and outside the Montana dark was full of stars. Caleb, Clara said from the chair by the fire. Yeah. I'm glad you went to the stage that morning. She looked at him with the direct, steady gaze that he had come to understand was not a performance of certainty, but certainty itself. I know it cost you something. The exposure, people watching. It was against every instinct you had. It was. I'm glad you went anyway. He thought about the man who had stood on the edge of that street in May, hat in hands, watching dust rise on the eastern road and feeling very much like a fool on display. He thought about what he had not known then, about Clara, about Maggie, about Cole, about the particular shape his life would take from that day forward. He thought about how completely wrong his predictions had been and how entirely glad he was. Me too, he said. Rose, fed and warm and apparently satisfied with the evening's proceedings, went to sleep in her mother's arms with a complete commitment of someone who has worked hard and earned the rest. Clara carried her to the cradle and settled her there with the practiced efficiency of 2 months of parenthood and stood looking down at her for a moment in the lamp glow. She was, Caleb thought, from across the room, watching his wife look at their daughter in the warm light of a home they had built together from nothing but courage and the willingness to try. She was exactly what happiness looked like when it was real. Not absence of difficulty, not simplicity, not the smooth, unmarked surface of a life where nothing hard had happened. This the specific gravity of a thing that had been fought for and won and was being held carefully every day by 2 people who understood its value because they knew what the alternative was. He crossed the room. She heard him coming and turned, and in her face was the expression she had stopped trying to contain. Around him, open present, the full weight of who she was available to be seen. He put his arms around her. She put her head against his chest. They stood there in the firelight while Rose slept and the night held them, and the ranch they had named settled around them into the particular piece of a place that has found its purpose. Outside, the stars continued their patient rotation. The mountains stood as they had always stood, The creek ran toward the valley floor in the dark, finding its way by gravity and time as water does, as all things eventually do toward the lowest and most open place, toward the place where something can grow. Inside Second Chance Ranch, two people who had been given a second chance held onto it with both hands and were grateful every day for the choice that had made it possible. Rose slept. The fire burned. The night went on.